Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for our Fish for Thought session. We're very lucky this morning to have with us Professor Chris Golden from the Harvard Institute of Public Health. He's an associate professor there. Chris has a background in ecology and epidemiology and a whole collection of disciplines that together make up what is being called planetary health, essentially the relationships between environmental health and the health of ecosystems and human health. And Chris is one of the sort of leading lights in this and has been working in the field. He says since 1999 in Madagascar, and I looked at Chris and I thought, okay, so did you start your fieldwork when you were 10? But apparently not that far off. He first went to Madagascar as a teenager and has had a long-term commitment to working there since, and has done almost a quarter century of field work in Madagascar. And from that sort of very strong field base, working largely with forest living communities who hunt bushmeat. He came from some sort of bushmeat to another wild harvest, fisheries, and since 2015 has been working on aquatic foods and the health implications of access to aquatic foods for different populations around the world. And Chris and I worked together on several projects, including with other World Fish colleagues, the recent Blue Foods assessment that was a lot of the work was published in the last 2 to 3 years. So Chris is still working in fisheries in Kiribati, Madagascar, and also in various sort of global collaborations. It's a real pleasure to have him visit us. He's spending a few days in Penang as part of a larger trip on the way back from Australia now to start teaching again next week, I think. And we're really happy that you were able to stop by at World Fish, Chris, and talk to us today about the human health implications of aquatic food access. So over to you, Chris. And welcome also to those of you listening online. Type your questions in the chat. Anis will pick them up, and we'll have a sort of question answer session after Chris's talk. So thanks very much, Chris.
All right, hopefully everyone, the mic is working. Good. Well, really nice to meet all of you. Looking forward to connecting to you in person, and thank you, Eddie and Anis, for having me. As they mentioned, I'll be talking about the human health implications of aquatic food access. To start with, and I think many of you already know these principles, but animal source foods are incredibly important for delivering human nutrition. So this is not about protein or calories, but it's really about the iron, the zinc, vitamin A, vitamin B12, fatty acids that animal source foods really uniquely deliver. And in places in the global south where there is kind of a leaching of micronutrients from infectious disease, a lack of fortification and biofortification, we really need to rely on animal source foods to deliver those types of nutrition. In a recent paper, you can see that the nutrient supply from marine small-scale fisheries have been shown to be incredibly important to the nutrient supply and nutrient intakes across a variety of different food systems. So if you compare artisanal, subsistence, industrial, and then mariculture and recreational, small-scale fisheries in some contexts are really important, whereas mariculture and aquaculture in other contexts are going to be really important. And it is really the partnership between the two of them and understanding how this kind of distribution of flows of aquatic foods can be important under different cultural, economic, social, and geographic situations. And so right now, I would not consider the two of those to be replacements for each other. I think that they really, really work well together, and we need to better understand those interactive dynamics. So to walk you through briefly how I'm envisioning this talk, we're going to start with some form of environmental change, thinking about fisheries declines or declines in access of aquatic foods, how that then leads to changes in the food supply, what that means nutritionally. And so reduced intakes of micronutrients and vitamins, and then depending on the social and economic situation of a different country, there will be diverse types of health impacts. In some cases, an increased incidence of micronutrient deficiencies, and in other cases, an increased incidence of non-communicable disease, so things like hypertension, obesity, and diabetes. And really, the role of aquatic foods is powerful in solving both of those two alternative futures of either micronutrient deficiencies or a reduction in NCDs. So to start with declining fish catch, and I promise this will ultimately come back to aquaculture and the incredible importance of that. We can see here that in these climate projections, fisheries are going to be moving poleward and kind of exposing this belt all along the equator where there'll be reduced access to fish catch. And so you can see upwards of 50% declines in fish catch all along this equatorial belt. From an ecological standpoint, these impacts are very clear. And what I see as a public health specialist is that the very places that are going to be losing access to fish the most are the same places that struggle the most with food insecurity, with marine and ocean governance, with climate adaptation, and a variety of other things that position them into this almost looming crisis of where there could be this real issue around food security. And so what sorts of alternative foods will people move into in the absence of these wild capture fisheries? And in a paper that I co-wrote with Eddie and Shakuntala and a variety of other colleagues, we harnessed an aquatic food composition database to look at the nutrient value of aquatic food products in comparison to other animal source food products. And what you see here is that it is lined up vertically from most to least nutritious across a variety of different nutrients. And you can see that the top 7 categories are all blue foods or aquatic foods. And so the small pelagics, the bivalves, the large pelagics, these are all things that are incredibly nutritious. And then the carps and the cephalopods and the salmonids, also incredibly nutritious in comparison to any sorts of terrestrial meats that are grown. And you have to think about this also in conjunction, not just from a nutritional standpoint, but from an environmental standpoint. And I'll get to that more toward the end of my presentation, that when you want to optimize based on reducing an environmental footprint and maximizing nutrient supply, really the hope for sustainable and nutritious food systems moving forward, I think will deeply rely on aquatic food systems. I guess the bottom line of this message is that if you are losing access to aquatic foods during transitions of nutrition, you are almost necessarily moving into nutritionally inferior products. And so we have to keep that in mind as we are thinking about these transitions in food systems. And so what sorts of dietary changes might we anticipate given a decline in access to aquatic foods? And I propose that there are 3 different typologies. These are, of course, lacking nuance and complexity, but just to give you an idea of the ways in which I think about this. If there is a lack of access to aquatic foods, let's say there's a collapse of local fish stocks in places like United States, South Korea, New Zealand, these countries will be relatively unaffected. The market will provide substitutes in the form of different fish species, slight price changes, but for all intents and purposes, the people who were consuming fish before will continue to, and the people who were not consuming fish before will continue not to. You then have countries like Madagascar, Gabon, Suriname, Malawi, where you have a reduction in access to aquatic foods, and then people are going to eat more starchy staples. They're going to eat more vegetarian sourced foods because animal sourced foods are prohibitively expensive for many people. And so in those cases, you'll have increasing undernutrition, increasing micronutrient deficiencies. And finally, you have the cases of places like Philippines, small island developing states in the Pacific, Brazil, Mexico, where you have an acceleration of the nutrition transition, where in the absence of aquatic sourced foods, you have people that are then relying on fast food, you have people that are relying on kind of high energy, calorically dense foods, snacks, ramen, tinned spam, mutton flaps, turkey tails, and things like that. And so what will happen in terms of positioning people for nutritional vulnerability, basically if we focus on that second typology of where undernutrition will increase, this paper really tried to outline that. So where you have kind of these large declines in access to small scale fisheries and wild captured fish, and also these countries in orange, where you have high dependence on seafood for nutrition and also a threshold by which the other components of that food system position you at nutritional vulnerability, any sort of tweak in access or reduction in access to these aquatic source foods will then rapidly increase these populations' prevalence and incidence of undernutrition. And so where do we go from here? What are the kind of technological or grassroots solutions to this? And aquaculture is one of the major ones. And so as I mentioned, when we think about the kind of synergies within aquaculture, it is very well positioned to be maximizing this kind of nutrition and environment nexus. And yet you have to understand that it's not just one product. It's not just beef or chicken or pork. And of course, I'm speaking to an audience that knows this all too well and far better than I, so I'm a little bit embarrassed presenting here. But there's an enormous amount of variety depending on what sort of aquatic food you're looking at, what sort of environmental impact it has, and its environmental importance. So one, it means that it's performing very, very well in terms of performance. Nutrient content, one means it's the absolute highest. And so where both of the branches are going out the furthest, that means that there is kind of a co-beneficial solution. So things like bivalves are turning out quite well. You also have things like salmon under some conditions, but really carps. Tilapias perform relatively well environmentally for things like water, but then are not as nutritious. So there's always going to be trade-offs based on different products and what you are trying to optimize and maximize. And so as we're thinking of sustainable food systems and the paths forward, we really need to think of these kind of intersecting lines together. Another major thing that we need to think about are the distributional efforts for aquaculture. And so one of the papers that we had written together was to think about the ways in which aquaculture was being produced and whether or not it served nutritionally vulnerable nations. And so here we developed 3 different typologies of countries that are producing aquaculture, and we highlight the 40 most nutritionally vulnerable countries on Earth. And in red, you have the countries that are producing little to no aquaculture. And because of the way that the market system is oriented, very little aquaculture products are naturally going to flow to countries like Libya, Yemen, Western Mauritania, etc. And so there's a lack of likelihood that aquaculture is going to serve kind of nutritional importance in those countries in red. And yet the countries in yellow are producing quite a bit of aquaculture, and yet it's almost entirely export oriented. And so from a nutritional standpoint domestically, again, fairly unlikely that there's going to be aquaculture benefits to those countries, because there's very often large companies that are producing the aquaculture, they're then exporting it, and that money would then have a very circuitous route to benefit those who are truly nutritionally vulnerable. Finally, the countries in green, these are the ones that have a likelihood of having domestic aquaculture truly protect the nutritionally vulnerable. And there have been great cases, and what I always cite in my presentations, always draw on world fish expertise to say where there is this kind of paired integrated rice and fish farming, where there are other systems that are gender sensitive and kind of climate mainstreamed and really thought through from the beginning, where you are thinking of these things from the outset to be nutritionally supportive and nutritionally sensitive, that's really where we see those sorts of wins. And finally, to kind of show you where we thought of this and kind of our grand scheme, if we are able to support aquaculture production sustainably, and this paper that we published, there was a roughly 26% increase in current global aquatic food production that was almost entirely attributed to aquaculture production. You see here the red is not highlighting very well, but you can see in part A, the areas at global levels that will increase their aquatic food consumption the most, and the correlative impacts that we'll have on other forms of animal source foods. And so part F is really highlighting what that ultimate picture will be. And so what you're seeing is that in the presence of an increased access to aquatic sourced foods, largely from aquaculture, you have an increase in aquatic sourced foods in sub-Saharan Africa, and also in non-aquatic animal source foods, because it does not kind of stifle or meet or plateau the need for increasing animal source foods. And yet in many other countries, it will actually displace some of these more harmful meats. So the red and processed meats that have adverse health outcomes associated with them. And so what we're seeing, and kind of what I positioned at the beginning of how there's these kind of two potential health streams, one of needing to fill the micronutrient gap and one in reducing access to harmful meats that would increase NCDs. Aquaculture is really seeming like it is serving both of those purposes based on the geographical distribution and historical price elasticities among food products, where in sub-Saharan Africa, it is serving both purposes. And in other parts of the world, it is filling the micronutrient gap while also reducing access to harmful meats that might serve to perpetuate the nutrition transition. And so ultimately what we're hoping to do is to harness nutritional sensitive aquaculture and fisheries management policies to increase access to aquatic foods, strengthening resilient food systems that lead to positive dietary change, and ultimately ending in nutritional security. And I realize that that sounds a bit fluffy, but I also recognize that a lot of the research that has been coming out of late from our group, from others' groups, are all pointing in the same direction, that we have to stop ignoring the incredible foundational role that aquatic food systems play in the path towards sustainable and healthy diets, and that it will be an absolutely critical piece to really understand to make sure that we can get there as a society. And with that, I would love to take any questions, and also to thank all of our kind of funders and partners. There's obviously a much larger list of that as well. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris, for that very comprehensive and yet succinct introduction to a huge body of work really there, and a lot of it very globally influential as well, in helping to put aquatic foods on the global food map, where it's largely been missing, I think, before this work of Chris and collaborators, really sort of took and elevated work that was being done at World Fish by Shakuntala and others, and sort of placed it in this very sort of global planetary health context. So that's been a really productive collaboration for World Fish as well, working with these groups that have helped us to bring our work to a wider audience across the sort of environment, food system, international development spectrum. So with that, do we have any questions from people online or in the audience? We'll start with people here. Alex.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for that. That was really, really interesting, fascinating stuff. I work a little with modeling nutrients in catches in East Timor, in Timor-Leste, in terms of nutrient potential. And you're absolutely right that the challenge is illustrating the value of those compared to traditional kind of production values. But I wondered, be it from Madagascar or any others, do you have any insight into the kind of change mechanisms there? How do we start to actually move or couple economic value of fisheries and nutrient values of fisheries? I mean, I struggle with the same questions, but
Sure.
I'm just curious.
Some of the work that we're doing both in Kiribati and Madagascar kind of get into that topic specifically, though in very different ways. So in Madagascar, we have data on fish catch, on dietary intake, and we actually have data from human blood samples looking at kind of a variety of nutritional status from vitamin A, vitamin B12, zinc, iron, etc. And so what we're trying to do is to understand if different kind of coastal governance regimes and or kind of gear restrictions may limit people's access to seafood in nutritionally meaningful ways. And so is there a balance between kind of conservation mechanisms for sustainable fishery production and nutritional well-being. And so you can do that through understanding people's diets in a very robust way, and then running scenario analyses that look at how kind of gear restrictions would alter people's access to aquatic food products, and then how that might alter human health. There's never going to be kind of perfect ways of doing this, but it's kind of the best ways that we can think of in terms of really understanding what the costs and benefits of marine conservation implementation might be. The temporal landscape on that is critically important, especially in the context of the places that you and I are working. And so with any of these, very often there is a short-term cost and a long-term gain, and how powerful that short-term cost could be when people are vulnerable is something that you really need to think about from an ethical standpoint prior to running any sort of intervention. But again, this sort of quantitative analysis is very useful at identifying those risks prior to those sorts of interventions taking place.
Thank you. Very nice and interesting summaries and observations. My concern is this sort of positioning aquatic foods from the micronutrient deficiency gap. Okay, it's good from the sort of the research and such people, but if you look at the countries at the country level, there has been very little influence to positioning aquatic foods with respect to this micronutrient deficiency, filling that gap. In many countries, if you look at the fishery strategies, aquaculture strategies, most of the investments are still talking only about the protein and export. And this message has not at all infiltrated into the many countries in Asia and also many countries in Africa. Look at the fishery strategies, look at the central government national policies. I think there's a lot of work for people like us to really take this message very strongly. This is talked at the level of, say, UN or at the level of higher bodies, but at the level of countries, almost the penetration is almost negligible, I would say, in many countries in Asia. And you attend any high-level policy meetings, the talk is of export, talk is of protein, talk is of food, but not at all. And this is where I think the major intervention should be not with the fisheries mainline departments, not with the fisheries universities, it has to be with the public health. It has to be with the social sciences people. It has to be with the women and child development. Unless we go and introduce fish and aquatics there and position it, if you only talk with the fish mainline agencies at the national level, we will be still going along the path of export protein. Yep. So I think this is where our major intervention must be at the level of other departments who are concerned with public health. There we need to really introduce the fish part of it. Thank you.
I think that point is so critically important. It's something that we have worked on a bit with the government of Madagascar. We try to make those points very clear in all of the writing that we do, but you end up getting completely different answers on whether or not you optimize based on protein or other micronutrients, and what fishes you would select in order to promote, what sorts of dietary gaps can be filled based on what you are focusing on from a nutritional perspective. The answers diverge widely based on that. Protein in almost all fish is almost completely correlated with body weight. Whereas all of these other nutrients, there's such enormous variance in terms of how they're actually composed within fish. And in terms of kind of climate impacts, dietary impacts, other sorts of impacts on the nutrient composition of those fish species, it's far more variable within these other nutrients as well. And so truly understanding that message and highlighting this critical role of aquatic foods in that mechanism, I think is super important in terms of leveraging your unique kind of niche and role here. The other thing to consider is that the entire kind of second typology of people eating more vegetarian or starch-based diets, you're not necessarily going to be losing a lot of protein by going into those diets. The only diets, for the most part, that are deficient in protein globally are those that are also deficient in calories. And so if you have enough food, you almost always have enough protein. So it really depends on the context where you're working too. And World Fish is not kind of a humanitarian emergency organization that is going in with places that are calorically deficient and trying to fill kind of an energy gap. And that's really where the protein energy piece comes in as important. World Fish is more in the sector of how can we create nourishing diets for people, and that really has everything to do with everything that is other than calorie and proteins. And so that message really needs to come through loud and clear.
I could just add a little context to that. I think your team recently authored a paper which produced a sort of decision support, almost
Yes.
a decision support model, to look at trade-offs between nutrition and environmental impacts and things, which is a really good, and looking at the current nutrition situation and what role aquatic foods could play, and which aquatic foods could play the best role given the available range of options. And I think that's a really a good tool to build on. And I was actually thinking that was something that World Fish could build on.
Yeah, I'm happy to circulate that paper. It's a decision support framework and a selection framework of which nutrients to choose based on different kind of research projects, ideas that you have, and goes through kind of this 3-stage process of how to actually come to that decision.
Yeah, and I think turning that into something that could be used to have dialogues with governments would be useful. And on a sort of slightly encouraging note in that, with some of my students, and I can't remember, Chris, whether you were on this paper or not, the review of global health policies, and no, you weren't.
Nope.
Okay, sorry. We looked at where fish aquatic foods were mentioned in public health nutrition policies, and also where the fisheries policies had specifically mentioned nutrition and addressing micronutrient deficiencies. And you're right, there's relatively few countries, but one of the interesting things to emerge is that the places where World Fish works and has worked are among those countries where that dialogue between public health and fisheries has really led to integrated or coherent policy. And that, the message there is that the work that we do can influence national policy, but we need to find a way to do that outside of the countries where we work, as well as continuing to turn what's written in policy documents into reality in the countries where we do work. So, yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Any other questions from the audience?
Yes, from here.
Online. Arun.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Arun from India. Thanks, Chris. Excellent presentation. In India, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare brings out National Family Health Survey reports once in 5 years. It consists of various parameters, health parameters of people, surveyed from all 750 districts of India. And also it consists of dietary habits of the people. And this includes the fish consumption pattern. But there is no, I have not seen any proper analysis of the consumption of fish and its relation to the human health and overall welfare of the people. So this enormous data, they surveyed over 1 million households in India every 5 years. So I invite you and your students to India to take up some sort of work on this and publish some good publications on this, freely available data. Thank you.
Yeah, Arun, thank you so much. I would love to take you up on that offer, and my team and I will actually be in India at some point this upcoming year to run a climate health training workshop, and so maybe we can connect in person there. But we've tried to gather as much publicly available data as possible that has been nationally representative. We've done it for 17 different countries, some of which fall into kind of World Fish's purview, but we did not do India, and so it'd be great to connect and see if we can harness that data set to do it for India as well. Thank you.
And this is from Mizanur Raman. Great presentation. Good point raised by Dr. Mohan. Positioning micronutrient vitamins for human health particularly vulnerable populations. So yeah, I think, endorsement from our colleagues in Bangladesh, where this is such a vital role.
Totally.
And I believe you've done some work with some of our colleagues in Bangladesh.
Yep.
On that issue. Any other questions? Comments, offers of collaboration, etc. Does anyone want to ask Chris what his favorite Penang seafood is? He's sampled quite a lot.
I haven't had the laksa yet, so Eddie,
okay. Laksa's next on the list.
you're on the hook.
Thanks. I mean, it's not a well-formulated idea, I suppose, but Hampus, who I think is online, and Eddie and myself have talked around or starting to develop this idea of island food systems and the importance in this context. A lot of the themes that you're talking about around, moving away from the idea of production and reliance on aquatic foods for energy or for protein and more. And I wondered if your experience in Madagascar, albeit an extremely large island, if that plays into that kind of theme and that dialogue a little.
Absolutely. I will send you over a paper that we published in Global Food Security 2 years ago now, and it goes through this kind of schematic of basically takes 3 different time trends. And as time evolves, there is a general trend toward ecological degradation, a general trend toward market integration. And we kind of framed this work in Kiribati where there were 30 different islands, and each one kind of sits at a different time point within each of those temporal trajectories. And what we were trying to figure out is to what extent the food system sat at that nexus of ecological degradation and market integration, and whether that food system output then had a direct influence on nutritional outcomes as they arose from that food system. And so we are still in the process of finalizing all of that data analysis, but it looks as though there are some really interesting ways of kind of conceiving of it through that sort of kind of structure. And so we framed it kind of in this social ecological trap dynamic of, as ecological systems degrade, they become entrenched, particularly in the presence of rapid market integration and proliferation. And so thinking about how nutritional outcomes might arise from these social ecological traps has been something that's particularly fruitful for our research group. And we've done this in Kiribati and Madagascar. One of my postdocs has done this in Puerto Rico. And then I have a master's student right now who is Native Hawaiian who's working on it in Hawaii and thinking about these sorts of things. So I would love to kind of carry on this conversation after the talk today and see if there's kind of interesting lessons that could be learned and synergized across different locations. That would be fun.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I think to add to the island food system story, one of the characteristics of a lot of particularly smaller island states is their history of. There's a colonial history often of islands being used as plantation systems for monocrops, sugar being the most common, copra, other crops for export, and that really undermined local food systems. And so that's had intergenerational effects. So part of that kind of island food system story is really to undo that colonization history. So we're also kind of calling it, we're framing it in this discourse of decolonizing food systems. So, I think there's a lot of interesting things around the island food systems idea. Excellent. I think unless we have any further questions, we do. Excellent. Hampus is online. Maybe Hampus wants to speak. Oh, okay. His quick comment is market integration is also an opportunity to distribute aquatic foods to more people. So not always a negative driver of degradation.
Yep. So yeah, I wasn't intending to say that was causally related, just more that we're looking at the intersection of both of those forces. And we have a article that is in review right now looking at the different ways that markets, kind of integration, product diversity, distance, et cetera, are all used as proxies for what a market means. And I think it will be very useful once that comes out to think about how we actually operationalize the definition of markets and how we tend to use it in our research.
Excellent. And Hampo, I don't know if you want to follow up on that in person or whether you're not somewhere where you can talk. Okay. Any other questions? Excellent. Well, thanks, Chris,
Awesome.
for a very stimulating, thought-provoking talk. Before you step off the podium, or maybe you can just step down here, that's okay. I wanted to pick a quote from your talk that sort of resonated with me, and I think is an important conclusion maybe for us at WorldFish to take away. You know, in this period of climate crisis, climate change, concerns about the lack of governance in some fisheries that's leading to overexploitation, and maybe gaps and incoherencies in aquaculture policy. You said if we lose access to aquatic foods due to some of those things, during this period of food system transition, we're inevitably transitioning into nutritionally inferior food. And so I think, you know, that's an important message for us to kind of take to our colleagues in the CG and into the food system discussion, that sustaining the future of aquatic foods is vital if we want to maintain the nutrition benefits and deliver the maximum nutrition benefits to the increasing population that we aspire to include in the future of nutritious diets, so that we play our role in meeting the SDG Zero Hunger targets, which is where all our CG institutes are pointed towards. So a very important message there about the vital importance of maintaining access to aquatic foods in food system transition. Thanks very much, Chris.